Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to another Red Pill Religion podcast. Red Pill Religion, where amongst the things we say is that a good religious argument is a great thing between friends. So it's a simple exchange of views. If you like the kind of material we're doing, please support our work on redpillreligion.com. Redpillreligion.com, where every day we have new videos by us and by others, new podcasts by us and by others, interesting interviews with different people. Please find us on please find our PayPal and Bitcoin and Patreon and Start page donation buttons there on redpillreligion.com. We could use your assistance, and we are looking into doing a fundraiser soon to maybe move to the Blog Talk Radio platform. Let's see what we see. In the meantime, after the show tonight, as per usual, we will be having our nightly philosophy talk for any young people who want to just come in and talk about, or old people who want to come in and talk about philosophy, ideas, spirituality. You'll always be welcome after this show tonight. Just be sure to join the Discord chat room, link in the low bar, and it'll be on redpillreligion.com. Find us on Gab, find us on Minds, find us on Facebook, and definitely find us on redpillreligion.com. Okay, so tonight we're honored, in fact, to have from Shoebat.org again, Ted. Say hi.
Hello, everybody.
And Andrew, please say hi.
Good evening.
Great to see you guys. We had a response video. The short story is that Michael Voris did an interview with Milo Yiannopoulos. Like some others, he's hardly alone in this. Like some others, Ted was unhappy with and highly critical of Voris, church militant, and Milo, of course. We took exception to some of what he said, although I think we're probably more sympathetic with each other than people think. There was at least a couple of people who were coming by dropping comments saying, "Whoa, what are you doing? You started trying to start a fight with Ted. What? Look, man, people argue. People have different points of view. I think the short summary of the way I see it, and then we can just go from there, is that I genuinely see the United States. I mean, when you refer to the United States as the culture of Sodom, it really, and others have been using that phrase now, it's been so obvious to me that that's true. And growing up here, and I spent much of my life as an atheist, right? And just growing up here, especially if you were what they call Generation X. I don't like the generation theory anymore. It creeps me out. But whatever. If you grew up what they call Generation X, the TV generation, I genuinely believe that America is filled with people completely confused with no moral guidance whatsoever. We've become godless. We accepted so many ideas. This is where I was sympathetic in many ways to a lot of what Milo was saying, just because we accepted a lie in the 80s. And I really believed this lie. I really believed it for the longest time, that homosexuality was this rare genetic condition. And the homosexuals I knew were mostly not obnoxious activists, but were usually insecure guys from real bad families and with a lot of issues, who I always had sympathy for, because I grew up tough too. And kind of the way I see it now, and I think this is very true of an enormous number of Americans, like, where do you go if you take a kid like Dustin, which I think I pointed out in my response video, that 11-year-old drag queen? When is that kid ever going to have an opportunity to even know there's something wrong? I mean, there has been stuff you had said in a previous video that I had noticed, that Americans and Canadians, especially, the gay thing is like everywhere. But what I keep running into is that I now meet people in their teens, 20s. They're self-identifying this way, and it's not a political stance. They're like, I see them as having been sucked into this ideology, because what they get in the sex education in the schools and what they see on the television and on YouTube and on the internet porn culture, they're lost and they're swimming in confusion. And I tend to see Milo as a guy who's moving in the right direction and trying to get other people to. Now, maybe you don't, but that's kind of where I would start this. What's your thoughts on any of this?
Well, let's look at Milo's statements, and let's look at the things that he said, both in the past. By past, I mean a couple of years ago, and what he said in the Michael Voris interview. He said 2 years ago that the relationships with those with older men have helped those young boys discover who they are and give them security and safety, provide them with love and reliable and sort of a rock where they can't speak to their parents. Some of those most important, enriching, and incredibly life-affirming, important, shaping relationships are between younger boys and older men. So would you say this is taking people to the right direction, or what?
No, you've got me there. You've got me there. I see Milo as having been in a place where I used to be, even where after I became Catholic. Because it doesn't always become a life transformer for us. I had a lot of work to do when I became a Catholic, and a lot of sinful habits that it was really hard for me to break.
Okay.
And in modern churchianity, modern I don't like that phrase, but in the modern Catholic Church, especially in the United States, liberal theology is everywhere, and I don't know. I guess I'm being incoherent there, but I see him as trying to hold on to stuff from the past and not really coming to the grips with the fact that no, really, those are sick and wrong relationships. I mean, I think he's rationalizing something there.
You see, he knows what he's doing is evil, because if he didn't, then he wouldn't have tried to rationalize it or tried to justify it before the press after those videos came out into the headlines. And then in the Michael Voris interview, and I think this is where our point of contention is, at least for the most part, in the Michael Voris interview, Milo never once said, well, I was wrong. What I said was evil. He said, well, I shouldn't have spoken too loosely. I was tired, or I had too many drinks, as if, yeah, when you're tired or you have too many drinks, the first thing you start doing is back in pederasty or start lamenting about the age of consent. And in that context, Mr. Voris then eventually asks the question, do you think that the age of consent should be lowered? And he said, I think 16 is a good number. Well, what's he talking about? He's talking about the same thing that he was talking about before, and that is relationships between younger men or younger males, youths, boys, and older men, which is what pederasty is. And then Voris never objected, and this was my issue with Voris the entire time. If you watch my commentary on that interview, it's quite clear. Voris never really combats anything that Milo says, doesn't object to anything that he says, doesn't question anything he says. Like, wait a second, Milo, you said this, that, and the other. What are you talking about? What do you mean you spoke too loosely? Are you saying are you saying that you actually opened up what you really think? Is that what you're saying? About the age of consent, what 16-year-old with a 40-year-old guy or whatever, stuff like that. And then Milo actually said in that interview that you have these cases where young boys can have security and an older man and blah blah blah, and Voris didn't say anything. So this is why I believe Voris is actually an infiltrator of some sort. I think that he is an agent of the underworld. Of the sodomite underworld. He's duping foolish and naive and gullible people.
See, now there's on the particular Voris case, I just can't give it to you on that one. I've been watching Michael Voris for too many years.
So have I.
And he's been so outspoken, and I mean, I used to think he was way too hard on the gays, and now I'm like, no, he's been right all along on what the problem has been. It has been ideological, homosexualist, entryists, predatory gays. That is what has invaded the Catholic Church in the United States. But how can he be an entryist with all that he's been condemned, all that he's been I mean, and censored and shut down. I mean, he's actually his apostolate is only about a half hour from where I am. He's not in a big fancy environment really. An old beat up TV station, I guess he rented or something. How can he be an entryist? I think maybe he's just an ex-gay who's a little too soft maybe on Milo. How could he be an entryist? I can't see it.
When I confronted, well, let me just address the first thing that you said. You said you've been watching Mr. Voris for all these years and all this stuff. Well, I've been watching Voris for years as well. Before I actually converted to Catholicism, I was studying heavily Catholic history and theology. And one of the things that I would watch on YouTube was Michael Voris. I watched a lot of his videos and I listened to a lot of his lectures. Watched his documentary on the Spanish Inquisition, and I thought he was great because he wasn't saying anything heretical. He wasn't saying anything sympathetic towards Sodom or anything evil. So like anyone else at that time, I trusted him. I trusted that he was a sincere individual. But then when he posted a story saying that us and Milo both agree on the unchanging teachings of the church, and yes, that is what that says. That's what the website said. And in fact, Christine Niles herself contacted me on Twitter, and it was on a public conversation, not a private one, so you can see it on Twitter. Contacted me on Twitter and said that she was the one who actually wrote that, and she actually stands by it. That's what she told me. So she was very emphatic about her position. And then when I told Voris that your website says this, and I said Milo is not someone who believes in the unchanging teachings of the church, and Voris is like, well, of course he does, and he's a married gay man. That's what Voris told me. And I said, well, your website says that you guys agree on the unchanging teachings of the church. So what are you talking about? And it just never really fazed Voris. He didn't care. When I brought up the fact that Voris supports homosexual eugenics, and yet Milo supports homosexual eugenics. And by that, I mean that he says that sodomites, or homosexuals, as most people call them, inherit a superior intelligence through their genetics. Are you there? Oh, I lost them.
No, you did not lose me. I apologize. I was absolutely listening. I muted myself out to avoid noise.
I lost you. You're very quiet. But back just to resume my train of thought. By sodomite or homosexual eugenics, I mean that Milo has said a number of times, both on Breitbart.com.
Gays are smarter, gays are better, yeah.
Have superior genetics and all this stuff. And he actually references a Japanese geneticist by the name of Satoshi Kanazawa to back his claim. And the reason why I mention this is because a number of years ago, back in 2016, I actually wrote an in-depth article showing how gay activists for years have been saying this, that they have superior genes, and they will reference Kanazawa. So I'm familiar with Kanazawa's work, and I referenced Kanazawa's work in my article. So when Milo brought up Kanazawa, I knew exactly what he was talking about, that he's bringing up this scientist who's been saying this for years. And he also said this on the Steve Crowder show, and that didn't bother Voris either. And I said, well, you know that he backs pedophilia or pederasty. Both are just as evil. And he said, well, we have our differences and our disagreements. Goodbye. And he hung up the phone. Voris didn't care. And for someone that, listen, I would expect this from someone like Gavin McInnes, who's a complete degenerate. But someone like Voris, who, as you said just now, has been for years talking about the Catholic faith, talking about Orthodox theology, talking about the importance of being militant for the faith, saying this sort of thing and not caring when a fellow Catholic who knows him is warning him about this. That to me is revealing that he has another side to him. And just to mention one more thing in my answer, I remember years ago, this is when I had become a new Catholic. This was back in, I want to say, in 2013. Michael Voris said on his show, if you are Catholic, you have to be ready. And he said it more in the form of a question. He said, are you ready to take up the whip as Jesus did and drive the heretics out of the temple? He said this. He says, if you're militant, if you're really Catholic, you have to be willing to do that. And believe it or not, that actually inspired me. And in 2014, so the next year, I got a camera and I confronted a known sodomite predator who is in the priesthood by the name of Michael Yarborough. And I got the whole thing on film. And I confronted Yarborough about the things that he did. He preyed on a young man by the name of Hector Escalante and sexually assaulted him. This is confirmed by the Diocese of San Antonio. And I confronted Yarborough on this, and then I went to his church and I told the ushers in the church that this man is a confirmed predator. Of course, they didn't care, and they kicked me out of the church. It's all on film. Yeah. I contacted Voris's producer, Matt McPherson. Or is it McPherson or Pearson? One of those two. Anyway, I called up Matt, and me and him have contacted each other before. I've been on Voris's show several times. So that, when I called Voris, I had his cell phone number. Like, I know the guy to a certain extent, and Mr. Fearson was always the kind of guy that when I wrote him, he would write me back within the same day. And I wrote to him and I said, hey, I got this video of me confronting this priest. And he said, yeah, that's the type of stuff we would love. Send it over. And I said, well, just give me some time to edit it and I'll send it over. So I compiled the footage together. I added some music and some words on the screen and all that. And I sent it over to him and I said, here's the video. And he never contacted me back. And 2 weeks later, I wrote to him and I said, hey, man, what happened to you? And he said, well, we played the video before our team, and he said that 9 out of 10 of us, everybody except one person in the studio wanted to play this video, except for one. So we couldn't do it. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure that was Michael Voris because he calls the shots. That's his place. They did not want to post that video. So if someone is confronting a confirmed predator in the church and you don't want to even play that video, and then you're telling people that you have to be willing to drive the heretics out of the church. You have to get a whip and be like Jesus. And then when someone like myself, who knows them, is saying, hey, Voris, Michael, you got to watch out. The guy is a total predator. The guy is a eugenist. The guy is backing man-boy, Nambla type stuff. Doesn't care. That, to me, is revealing. It's revealing.
Well, and given that you have more contact with Voris than I do, you have greater insight than I do. I am just looking at it from the outside as a sort of fan. I mean, Voris actually used to make me cringe because I thought he was too hard sometimes. But from what I've seen lately, I can't even say that anymore. I know that when I heard that interview where he was making the jokes about kids really wanting it and all that. I remember when that came out at the time, just getting a little sick because I remembered talking and joking and thinking that way myself not that long ago. And,
you joked about stuff like that?
I did. And it is true. So much of what Milo says about how if you've come out of a pedo environment like that, one of the things is you do start joking about it. In fact, if you're young and you're hanging out with pedos, they tell jokes like that around you. And if you don't, I can't explain exactly the foggy headset that you're in when that's the only universe you know. That's where the adults who talk like, that you look up to talk like. It's a very sick and depraved environment for a 13-year-old, or we were the same age when we got preyed upon. Although I was, in the public schools, which nobody ever talks about, or what a rape haven those are. But in any case, yeah, I mean, I used to joke, and I used to think jokes like that could even be healing somehow. I don't think, and that's what I heard when he made that joke. And it kind of made me sick too, because I realized, yeah, what I'm saying is completely wrong, but I'm laughing anyway. It's a very,
That's pretty disturbing.
Well, I'm sorry that, it is what it is when you've come out of that kind of,
It's disturbing, nonetheless.
Be disturbed. It's a universal reality I'm starting to see all over the U.S. I know so many young people, usually fatherless, who are just lost in what we could only call degeneracy. I mean, the porn culture, the it's everywhere. And the young people don't even know better half the time. I mean, I guess you could quote scripture and say they know better in their hearts, but really the young people are lost. And I mean, I guess that's why, I mean, when I became Catholic, one of the things that meant so much to me was the message of mercy. You know, the church has strong, has strong standards, but it also, there's that infinite mercy thing. And
well, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Since you have this experience, you were in the men's rights movement. Is that correct?
Yeah, I sure was, man. If I got to start it, yeah, I was in that.
Would you say that there is this sort of mentality in that circle?
Much more of it than I really saw, or than I was really conscious of at the time I was in it. But
Wow.
yeah, there is that element is there. There's also a Luciferian element in there that I thought I was being very useful to some people, so I was shielded too. It eventually went very bad, but yes, there's some people with that there's definitely a mentality of nihilism and sex and hedonism within that whole men's rights sphere that's very disturbing, because the stuff we were actually talking about mattered. I actually view that element as having destroyed any chance that it could have come to anything good, because the issues are live, the issues are real. I'll talk to you an hour about what's happened as a result of fatherlessness, as a result of the broken divorce court system, was about what's really going on with domestic violence and the Duluth model. All of that stuff we were talking about was real live issues that all deserve addressing, but the people within it, there's some really horrible people in it.
Yeah, I noticed that because I think Milo also was a part of that men's rights way of thinking, and there was a bunch of Paul Elam and a lot of these other guys, and the whole MGTOW thing. And there's just something very off about the whole men's rights movement. It's like, the way I look at it is, it's like feminism, but for men.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I used to say this at the time, and some of us would even agree. What we're doing here is essentially stupid, and even embarrassing, because the idea of a men's rights movement is inherently absurd.
There's no like
the thing is that there needed to be some vehicle to push back against the ideological feminism, and we were actually, I would argue, extraordinarily effective at that. Especially up in Canada, where we just broke the press. It was kind of the basic strategy, just so you know, was to kind of use their own tools against them and force them to pay attention to what we were saying by inflaming and provoking them. You can approve of that or not, but it's what we were doing, and it did work. We broke through a lot of narrative crap that was especially in the Canadian, but also the US press. And what I've noticed now is a ton of the things we were saying 4 or 5 years ago when I was doing that are now coming out of everyday people's mouths. So,
yeah, true.
I mean, from my view, I still talk to people who are doing that, right? And I try and talk to them sanely. Some of them are quite insane, but some of them are people who know, look, we got to one way or the other make people aware of what's happening to our boys in our schools, especially, and the way they're getting drugged up on Ritalin. And I could go on. The litany of issues is actually all quite live. I recommend that movie, The Red Pill. It's a very good film. Although I will say again, there's nefarious people in it. The information in it, I'll stand by.
But I think that what they do, because you're saying that you guys said things that were true. Okay, fine. I can concede to that. You guys obviously said things that were true. But it's like, what was the motivation? And that's the question. What's the motivation of the people behind it? And the way I look at it is, I find a parallel between that and the counter-jihad movement. For a while, it pains me to say this, but we were kind of being used as well by these people who were behind the counter-jihad movement. That when you say that you guys used their strategy against them and then said things to provoke and anger and get a rise out of them, that's essentially what the counter-jihad has been doing since 9/11. And It's been very effective, and they are very powerful and wealthy people behind the counter-jihad movement, very wealthy people behind the counter-jihad movement. And we, at a time, were getting funded from, I'll say their names, the Chernicks, Aubrey and Joyce Chernick, very wealthy Jewish philanthropists in Hollywood who are connected to the Hollywood elite. They were giving us tens of thousands of dollars to talk about Islam and worship the state of Israel. That's what they wanted us to do. And then once I began to write articles, because I was at the time, and this was in 2013, I was very naive to what I wasn't naive, because I knew that these people were funding us. But I began to write articles on the sodomite agenda, the LGBT agenda, and all that stuff. And then Joyce Chernick contacted us and said, hey, if you want our money, then you better stop talking about the gays. And we were like, well, you can't tell us what to do, and we're not controlled by money. And they said, well, we're not going to give you any more money anymore. We said, okay, so be it. And that was it. We were on our own after that. That was in 2013. And that moment, that experience woke me up. It really struck me and made me think, like, okay, what is this counter-jihad movement? What is it really about? This whole movement, I'm just talking about Islam all the time. What is it really about? Because that was something that I always disagreed with. I always disagreed with this idea of just talking about Islam all day, because there are so many different things happening in this world.
I know, and it doesn't all reduce to Islam. It doesn't.
And that's one thing. Like, one factor in my life that made me disagree with this way of thinking was when I was going to high school. When I was in high school, you know, you had some Muslim kids and all that, but most of them didn't care about Islam. But then you would meet these atheist kids who believed in evolutionism and believed in Darwin. And I remember, like, one time I was in high school, and I was talking to this guy who was an atheist. He was a hardcore militant atheist. And I said, we started arguing over the existence of God. And I said, well, okay, you're an atheist, right? He goes, yeah. And I said, you believe in the theory of evolution. He goes, it's not a theory, it's a fact. You know, it's real.
Oh, Lord.
And I said, okay, so you believe in evolution? He goes, yeah. And I said, but how do you reconcile your morality with the idea or the ideology of survival of the fittest that came from people like Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin? And he looked at me and he said, well, that's just life. If you're retarded, you're going to effing die. That's what this guy told me. So, like, having these conversations with people made me really think, like, you know, there's more going on in this society than just people reading the Quran.
Oh yeah.
You know, I remember when I was in high school, I had a really, really intense debating experience with a teacher. I won't give his last name, but his name was Drake. His first name was Drake. And Drake and I would get into these arguments for hours on certain things. And this guy was a teacher. He wasn't a student. And he said, well, Adolf Hitler was insane. And I said, well, if Adolf Hitler was so insane, then how come he was smart enough to deceive the whole freaking country of Germany and make them think that he was a god? And he's like, well, I have towers of documentation, psychotherapy, analysis confirming that he was insane. And I said, well, they bring it over. I'll bring it over. And he never brought it over. But in that discussion, you know, I began to talk about how Hitler was evil, and the things that the Nazis did was done wantonly. It was done deliberately. It wasn't done because of mental illness or something like that. And the other kids began to tell me to shut my mouth, and I didn't know what I was talking about, and listen to the teacher. And it was just like total conformity manifesting itself before me, like total societal conformity, and how that looks like. And I used to take the school bus, and the school bus sometimes would be like an hour long, depending on the traffic. So it gave me a lot of time to think, which is one thing I really liked about taking the school bus. And as I was on the bus that afternoon, I thought, you know, something is truly wrong with this society. And I used to tell my father, like, there's more to it than just Islam. And he agreed with me. He never once disagreed with me on that. And he encouraged me to write on these issues. And so when I began to write on these issues, people that were in our circles did not like that. And, oh no, just talk about Islam and worship the state of Israel. Well, there's more to life than just that, you know.
Yeah. Oh, and the indoctrination in atheism of the culture is what drives a lot of it. But to answer your question, how did I find myself in the men's right movement? Okay, brother, you're gonna believe me or you're not. I won't go into the whole story, but I I had a religious vision, and I was convinced God wanted me there. And that's just the plain truth. I mean, I can go into more, but I felt like I was supposed to be there. And literally the day I left, it was like I felt like it was a tug, God saying it's time to go. Now, I might be insane. You're not required to believe it, but that's why I was there. And I could see the justice of what we were doing, and then I could see things in the shadows that were not so good. But I always felt like, no, you're still supposed to be here. No, you're still supposed to be here. And one day it was like, you need to leave now, and so I did. And I still tell people it's a good movie because it is. And the work we were doing, look, the work I was doing with Aaron Pitsy, the work I was doing with others was good work. I can tell you what I eventually discovered, which is that a lot of what you probably suspect about the men's rights movement is true. It was put forth as a grassroots movement, but as is usual in these cases, the real grassroots people who were there because they were there for the cause, there were people in the background pulling the strings. And with money, basically people I would call modern Trotskyists, right? Basically globalist, Marxist, red diaper baby, trust fund brats who are dissenters on the feminist party line, but otherwise our party line. And they have this whole thing called gynocentrism, which is not necessarily a bad word, but the gynocentrism theory is to get down to it, it's basically an inversion of feminist patriarchy theory, and it's just as postmodern, batty, insane. It's ultimately based on the idea that the Christian religion and the Jewish religions caused men to be oppressed by women for thousands of years. It's hideous and awful and stupid beyond belief. But they were trying to get that into gender studies programs because they thought they saw a meal ticket there. I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt there. I don't mean to interrupt you. Please keep going.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, that's what the gynocentrism theory is. So you'll see people use, I'm seeing the phrase gynocentrism spread through the culture, and it's just this idea that we're female-centered in how we see things. But underneath it, there's these people peddling this, I call them neo-Trotskyist, basically. They're with the whole globalists, one world, one ethnicity, one religion thing, but they don't like feminism. And they basically, after the Red Pill movie was done shooting, there was generally a purge of a whole lot of people, actually during and immediately after the filming of that footage. So there was a lot of people got betrayed and backstabbed and the usual things that happen when I don't know if I'd call them entryists, but yeah, so if you suspect there's bad people in the men's rights thing, there are, and there's real bad things within that message. The reason I still maintain an interest in it is, as I say, the issues are live, and I do a lot of talking to really lost young men. That's kind of what especially the main channel is geared to. Rough, rowdy, fatherless young men. That's who I try to do outreach to. It's not a real lucrative way of going, but it's young men really in this culture need somebody, and they need someone to tell them that the things that they're thinking about what's going on with families, with feminism, with dating, with all that, they need somebody smart who can talk to them. And frankly, I think it's good if they see a Christian who's among them, because I don't try to proselytize them. I don't try to tell them what to do. I try to tell them what I know is true. Some guy's talking about how he does porn. I could just snarl at him and say, that's disgusting. But what I prefer to do is say, well, that's not good for you. If you ever want to stop, let me know. That's just kind of my approach to that whole crowd, because young men especially, they really need guidance, and they're getting the worst possible stuff online. So
but porn is one thing. Promoting pederasty is another.
I'm not seeing it as promoting pederasty. If we're going back to the Milo case, maybe you do. Maybe it's just because the jokes bounce off me faster than you. You know, when they said the age of consent was 16 and is about right, they meant. I mean, I took that to mean that it's the difference between child rape and two people capable of sinning. Basically, I don't think the 12-year-olds can quote unquote consent. 16-year-old can't. That's what I took them both as saying.
Okay, so let me just address this. So, they were speaking in the context of what Milo said about pederasty. That's a fact. That's the reality. If you watch that interview, and I'm sure you did, it's right there.
Making a case that it's not the worst thing in the world, right?
Well, Milo is saying it's not the worst thing in the world, and blah blah blah. But that's like saying, you know, some kid got raped, and then someone comes up and says, well, that's not the worst thing in the world. You know, have you ever like gotten nuked, or has your like whole village been slaughtered, and blah blah blah. It's like, well, what's the point of even bringing that up? You know, we're talking about, did Milo promote pederasty? And if you look at his statements, one of the things that he said was, this is one of the reasons why I hate the left, because the left puts these limits on love and all this stuff, and this arbitrary age of consent thing, and yada yada yada. That's what he said. Now he said, well, I was kind of like under the influence of alcohol, or I was kind of tired of all, like as if that's what you do when you're a little drunk or a little tired. That's not an excuse. That's BS. He was BSing his way in that Michael Voris interview the whole time, and Voris never called him out on it because he doesn't care. He wants that stuff to be promoted.
Okay. I think he's just too lax, but okay.
Hold on. He's the host of a show that calls itself Church Militant. Now, people will say, well, what he said was a joke. You don't joke about stuff like that. You just don't. That's sickening. Like, you don't joke. That's like I'm gonna make a joke about killing kindergarten students or something. Like, that's not funny. And then he went off about the arbitrary age of consent. And then in that context, Voris asked him, what do you think about the age of consent? Because Milo brought up the age of consent in the discussion. And Milo said, I think 16 is okay. And then Voris is like, well, the canon law would agree with you. What do you mean canon law? What does that have to do with? We're talking about this guy.
No, wait a minute. That's about. Isn't that just about whether or not it's between child rape versus two people who are able to make their choice to sin? I mean, that's kind of all I heard there. And
okay. So 16-year-old. Okay. So what if someone is like, there's 365 days in a year. So what if someone is 15 and 364 days old?
See, and that's where you get into the difficulty of a question like this. When is it child rape versus a 16-year-old who made his choice to go with the older guy? What is that line?
And evil either way.
I'm sorry, what?
It's sickening and evil either way.
Well, you win there. It is. It is.
All of a sudden, it's better. Come on.
Well, yes. No, actually, I will say yes. It's better. I don't know how you measure these things, but I mean, really, I think it's inherently obvious that an 11-year-old versus a 16-year-old is a world of difference. At least in terms of how society's going to look at it. Now, and even from a Christian perspective, I'd say in one case, in the 16-year-old and the 28-year-old, it's two people who are capable of sinning versus the 28-year-old and the 11-year-old. That's one person sinning. And that's just what I see. And I see him as somebody who grew up in these depraved relationships, who hasn't really fully come to grips with how depraved it was, and still trying to hold on to it. But I don't.
He hasn't.
When he says, "I admit that this is wrong," when he says, "I admit that I don't consider this marriage a real marriage,"
He goes off and says, "Well, the only thing Milo said, the only thing that I really regret is I spoke too loosely and I gave them too much ammo." And then Voris says, "Yeah, you gave the left too much ammo." Are you freaking serious? Like, Voris should have been, I mean, you call yourself church militant and you're sitting there like, you gave the left too much ammo? So if Milo was a left-winger saying these things, you don't think there would be any conservative saying, hey, look, the left is saying this is okay. This is a slippery slope towards pedophilia. You don't think they would be saying that? But because Milo has the Catholic title, but because he has the right-wing title, then all of a sudden it's like, well, let's just make these little remarks to try to make it not as bad as what it really is.
Yeah.
It is true that not Michael Voris, but Milo was booted for pedophilia. I mean, that's why he lost his position on the right wing, because of his comments. And, in all fairness, if it said it's not a political issue, the guy is supporting pedophilia. And when Michael Voris comes out and says, well, this is a political issue because of the left, I mean, I have a hard time squaring that circle, because if this was a quote, if this was a right-wing guy, it's okay, but it's left-wing, it's not, because this is an issue of politics. This is an issue of principle. I mean, sodomizing, sodomy and sodomizing people who are underage, those are two objective moral and social crimes.
I mean,
so
okay, go on. Sorry, Andrew.
Oh no, that's all I was having to say. Is it's within itself, it is it's a social crime by ethical standards, and it's also a moral crime. And this is Michael Voris, the head of Church Militant, proclaiming Catholic truth.
And not exactly
he has nothing to say about it.
Okay, so wait a minute. How much? Okay, I'll tell you honestly. When I heard the original Milo interview, it caused me all kinds of confused flashbacks to my past. B, I did laugh. Fine, call me depraved. I did, because I didn't. You get to this headset where you don't take stuff like that seriously, and he's drunk and it's late, and maybe it is the equivalent of a Freudian slip, and he needed to rethink things. How long does he have to wear? I don't know. Maybe he has to completely, disassociate with his gay lifestyle or something before anybody will believe him. I don't know. I saw Voris as being kind and understanding to somebody who's pretty screwed up, but he is doing some good. And I do think he's doing some good, and maybe that's where you think I'm a fool. I'm familiar with this sort of hypocritical, half-assed Christian who's trying and failing and still in denial about certain things. I look at, people who are struggling with constant sin. There's a reason we have the sacraments and confession. People do struggle with constant sin. He's to me, he's a guy who's managed to get through the wall. Because he's everything they hate, just like he says. He's everything they hate, or he's everything they're supposed to like and defend, but he's not saying what they like.
I don't know how that's a good thing. Like, oh, he's gay and he's Catholic. Like, why am I supposed to like that?
Well, I would also like to add one other part. Milo Yiannopoulos, he curiously says, it's around the 52-minute mark in the interview, 52:25. He directly says, am I going to give up? Let's see if I can find what he said, because I was very interested in this. Here's what he said. He said, do I give up something that gives me power, that gives me reserves of strength, that enables me to do good in the world? Now is the conclusion I've come to, because it would make me less good at the good stuff that I do. Now, the very fact that one is willing to mention this homosexuality gives me power. Now that's pretty suspect right there, because sure, somebody could say that, well, he's using the popularity of the LGBT to leverage himself to a public sphere. But it is a known fact throughout history, throughout cultures, pagan cultures, and especially in the 20th century with Crowley and his dilemma and his beliefs, that homosexuality is tied to power and witchcraft. Now, I have to say that there is an admission on his part of partying with, as he said, very young boys, which was the reason he was thrown out of it. He now admits that this gives him power, and he goes on a television show with a man who is supposedly a former homosexual, who was involved in the homosexual lifestyle for 20 years, and they start talking about the age of consent. Now, I know the age of consent is a topic of discussion, but that doesn't seem like the most appropriate thing to discuss because it's too curious. It's not the individual pieces. It's when they're all put together that they form this very strange picture that I can't help but question. Everybody talks about, we're sinners and so forth, and there is truth in it. But let's face it, a lot of people will use the cover of religion, they'll use discussion of sin to hide a more nefarious agenda. And the fact that if one looks at Milo's books behind him, it's filled with books by Nietzsche, and if I'm not mistaken, also, I don't remember if Julius Evola was there.
I know
that's
Evola.
And if we look at some of these stories, Ted and I spend a lot of time tracking stories about the LGBT movement because this is a big thing. This is a very important topic. So, when we see stories, for example, just the start of this here, let me pull up my screen right here and see what I have. You have a Christian pastor in Africa imprisons a teenager in his house and sodomizes him for 7 days. You see a 16-year-old girl. She was engaging in group sodomy sessions and it destroyed her intestines. So she has to wear a colostomy bag for the rest of her life. A married sodomite raping his mentally disabled son for twice a day for years and then racially abusing the judge at the trial. I mean, there was a study done that came out recently where scientists found the site of Sodom and they were examining the composition of the dirt. And they said that thousands of years ago, the equivalent of a 100 megaton nuclear bomb was exploded in that area. It was hotter than the sun. So, the Bible talks about why did God destroy Sodom? Because of this sin. So, whatever perceived, not only whatever perceived good can Milo have that he believes he's doing, if he genuinely believes it, it doesn't compensate for the evils of this particular sin. And the other part is, if this is so heinous, and he's alluding to the fact that he's tied, that he may be involved in other activities also associated with LGBT, witchcraft, magic, magic and so forth. I mean, this is a rabbit hole that just keeps getting deeper. The more I hear him speak, the more questions I have. And the fact that Voris is not confronting him on it, that he's not even suggesting going deeper, the fact that he even had him on the show and brought these topics up, that's very questionable. I find that highly questionable.
Especially after I brought it up with them.
Well, yeah, and I can't even say what's up with that. I mean, at this point, I would only be speculating anyway. I can't say that you're wrong in any of your objections. And so it might just be that I'm going with my heart and that I see somebody who's trying to move things in the right direction. I mean, I know so many Catholics now. Who are completely in with the whole gay agenda thing. And it's very common around here.
So are you implying that I don't have a heart? Or
No, come on, man, don't take it like that. I guess maybe you seem pretty harsh on it.
There was a story that came out, and you're right. There are a lot of Catholics that support the LGBT movement. But the fact is, this shouldn't be a surprise. This is because I remember I had a talk with a friend who was a missionary in Louisiana, Catholic. And he said he believed that 60% of the church, and this was 10 years ago, was in a state of what he called active apostasy. They were baptized pagans, if even that. There was a story I did in September of 2017, if I'm not mistaken. That story, I mentioned that the majority of Catholics, for the first time ever in British history, back abortion and sodomy more than they oppose it. And this is in spite of the fact that these two things are inherently opposed to the faith. You can't support these things. So, yeah, I'm not surprised that these people are supporting him.
And we have.
I'm sorry?
And we also have the issue of bishops who are down with all this.
No one's going to deny that, absolutely. But I would like to say, though, with this, that one should not be surprised about this. One should not be surprised at all. It's all too common, and it doesn't make it any less of a sin. I mean, it's a fact that in the 4th century, I think it was 70% of the laity and 80% of the bishops did not believe the divinity of Christ. That didn't change the divinity of Christ. It just meant you had 70 to 80% of people were heretics. That's all.
Or lost, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, let's face it, it's not good. But the fact is, times change, but man does not. God does not change. Truth is truth. I mean, you could have a law that outlaws the existence of gravity. Go ahead, jump off a building. Let me know how it goes. Let me know if you fly. It doesn't change the nature of it.
I can understand that point of view. Well, and you may be right. I may be just maybe I'm too loose in my own spirituality. I don't know. Maybe I'm too forgiving. Maybe I'm too inclined to want to see these guys as doing the right things, even though they're flawed. That's still what I'm seeing. I see some really flawed, screwed up people trying to do the right thing.
But trying to do the right thing when he's pushing for pederasty and pushing Sodom and homosexuality, and then saying that he's a Catholic and all this stuff. Like, I don't see how he's doing the right thing. If anything, he's just mixing up things that are true because he's saying things that are true. But he's mixing that up with lies and actually deceiving people. And if you read in the New Testament, Jesus says that false prophets shall come and deceive the very elect. Well, how do you deceive the very elect? Do you put purple hair, make your hair purple and put piercings on your face and say, hey, follow me? Or do you say, oh, this is because I'm a Catholic and I'm struggling with this. I know it's wrong, but I love it. I know Sodom is wrong, but I love Sodom. Like, how is that even doing the right thing? If anything, that's just someone who is doing something for very nefarious reasons.
All right. Well, you know what? You've given me a lot to think about it. Maybe I haven't thought hard enough about it. I don't go off on. I'm just going to whip out and say that I'm trying to find the video. I should have brought it, and it's just something I'm always acutely aware of that we all. Huh?
I was going to say, but you see, I remember watching a video of you talking. It was the same night that Voris put out his interview with Milo, and someone actually asked you a legitimate question, and that is, why do you support the sodomite Milo? And you rudely said, get the F out of my channel, blah, 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 blah. And I listened to that, and I'm like, well, where was the charity there?
There wasn't any. I was annoyed, and I was upset. And I'll just give it to you. As I spent a lot of my years dealing with men who dealt with sexual abuse and child abuse and things like that. And at that moment, I was very sympathetic in thinking of the 13-year-old Milo, and I didn't like hearing him called a sodomite. Straight up, I was angry. It was rude.
He is a sodomite, and that's what the Old Testament calls them.
All right. Would you not agree that most of America at this point are sodomites at some level?
No.
I mean, so you don't agree that somebody is whacking off to porn or going to prostitutes. You don't believe that that's any form of sodomy. Okay.
No, that is sexual. That is a form. Those are forms of sexual sin. But having sex with the prostitute and then two guys sodomizing each other, those are two different things. They're sins, nonetheless.
Yeah, I don't see the Bible even making that distinction. That's really not how I've ever read the scriptures. No, the Bible has no concept of homosexuality. Okay. That's what Paul was saying in Romans 1 and 2.
He was saying there's no distinction?
Well, the way I read Romans 1 and 2, he wasn't even ultimately making it about the sexual sin. He was making about all the kind of depravity that comes from denying God.
If there's no distinction, that's implying that there's no distinction between men and women, and there obviously is. There obviously are distinctions between men and women. I wouldn't be saying that.
From my perspective, all fornication is fornication.
Yeah, I have sex with a woman, but then if I sodomize a dog, those are two different things.
Well,
Okay.
Well, with that, there's also a couple of good guides here to look at. I mean, we have good guides in the church. So there's 4 sins in the Old Testament that specifically cry out to heaven for vengeance. It's the willful murder of the innocent, which according to there's the sin of Sodom specifically. There is the oppression of the poor, the widow and the orphan, and the deprivation of the working man of his justly earned wages. Now, one of the great things I find when talking about the Sodom issue is how much of the sacred tradition there is on discussing this, because any questions resolves it pretty fast. And what I have right here is I wrote about this once. I think it was earlier this year. It was a few years ago I wrote about it. And I found a bunch of writings from the saints on the LGBT. And this is not just things that are recent. This is things that go back a long time. We're talking to some of the earliest days of the church. And I kept my list short because, frankly, I got a lot of things I have to write and do. So what I did here, St. Augustine, talking about the sins against nature, like Sodom, how he says they are, quote, abominable and deserve punishment when they are committed. All nations committed them, they would be held guilty of the same charge. Saint Peter Damian, Catholic saint from the 11th century, spent his entire life fighting the LGBT, and he wrote a book called the Liber Gomorensis in Latin. You can read it. You can get a copy of it in English. It's been translated multiple times. And he talks about specifically sodomy as the sin of Sodom, not simple adultery, not fornication, not just any kind of sexual sin, but this particular act holds a particular hatred in God's eyes. It's the same distinction with the willful murder of the innocent. And there is one of the things, there's a difference between manslaughter, as secular law recognizes, and premeditated murder. There's a tremendous difference. Just as in willful murder of the innocent,
that's what we had.
Fighting somebody in a war, like the Canaanites that Israel went to war with, they're not going to hell for fighting that. But taking a baby and sacrificing it to one of these, bull gods they had in the Middle East, that was what Elijah warned about. It was that sin. He said, stop doing it.
And the understanding, the understanding that you have, and maybe I have had it wrong all these years, that sodomy is specifically men having sex with men, and that is all sodomy is.
It's the sin of sodomy it's the homosexuality. It's very clear. I mean, I can even send you the links to my articles. Everything's laid out right there. And again, you don't have to believe me. You can just go to the references in the church fathers that I have, or whatever. I mean, you can look it up yourself.
Send it to me, and I will look at it, and maybe I will be wrong.
No, it's not a problem. You see, it's everything is right there. From what I found is, writing about the LGBT, who I have to say, I found them to be more vocal and more aggressive than all the Muslims, and I've worked with Muslims for almost 2 decades. You find that this is a serious issue, and again, but we don't have to worry about what to say or think, because this is a question that's been answered ages ago. The answer's already in front of us. The thing is that a lot of people, they just don't want the answer. Various reasons they have, but the fact is, it's there, and that's what we have.
Okay, send me that article. I'll make sure to get that link out so people can see it, and I'll read it and I will see if I need to rethink my thinking or need to update it. And that's just where I'll leave it. I will think harder about the things that you have said, and I will leave it there. I've been honored to have you guys on here. Did you have anything else you wanted to say before we go?
Yeah, just to clarify in Romans 1 real quick.
Yeah.
Romans 1, starting in verse 26, it says, "And for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them, talking about the same people, up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossipers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. And then he goes on to say, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them.
And I will note that I mentioned that, and I read where he goes on, and said, I mean, I read the entire thing as an assault on godlessness and what happens when you become godless. And I also view, I note two, I didn't mention it before, but 2 Peter, what are the verse numbers? This is something that hang it, I'm sorry. Dear friends, yeah, but there's one thing, dear friends, that you must never forget no, that's the wrong one. Paul. There, okay, so 2 Peter 3, chapter 14 through 16. So then, my dear friends, while you are waiting, do your best to live blameless and unsullied lives so that he will find you at peace. Think of our Lord's patience as your opportunity to be saved. Our brother Paul, who is so dear to us, told you this when he wrote to you with the wisdom that he was given. He makes this point too in his letters as a whole whenever he touches on these things. In all his letters, there are, of course, some passages which are hard to understand, and these are the ones that uneducated and unbalanced people distort in the same way as they distort the rest of Scripture to their own destruction. And he goes on a little bit more from there. From my perspective, this passage in Romans is exactly what he's talking about, because Paul ultimately, I believe, in that section is talking about the sin of judgmentalism and all the sins that went around with the people who went with their debased passions. I don't have the quote in front of me, but all the wicked things they do and say, and their boastfulness and their deceitfulness and all of that. But that came out of denial of God, not simply from sexual perversion, like the sexual perversion is at the end. That's how I read it.
But if you read Romans 1, it's specifically talking about sodomites, and also you reference St. Peter, but St. Peter also said in the 2 Peter chapter 2, he says here, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterwards would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, for the righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Again, this is all talking about Sodom. So he's saying the destruction of Sodom was done as an example for all of us.
I do, and having just read about Sodom and Gomorrah again, whenever I think of Sodom and Gomorrah, I think of all the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah that went with it, not just the sexual sins. So perhaps, again, I need to just go ahead and look at your article, because I'm not going to sit here and say you're wrong. Maybe you know something I do. Maybe I haven't thought it through hard enough. I'll look at the article. To me, the whole thing screams of all the vile passions that come out of denying God and all the wickedness that comes from that. But, maybe I haven't thought my position through far enough.
Right there, they became sodomites, and they became inventors of evil things, violent, evil, all that stuff, malicious, which is traits that you see throughout the entire sodomite movement, by the way, including people like Milo and the rest of the right-wing.
Raving narcissism. There's no question about it. I see it. I try and remind myself when I see it, though, that we're all sinners. And that's all. I guess that's all I can say right now, is that we're all sinners, and I have problems with the sin of judgmentalism. And I mean, we have to make discernment, but we have, like I said there in Romans 2, Paul's talking very strong language about being judgmental.
which one bothers you and disturbs you more, being judgmental or being a promoter of Sodom?
Yeah, well, there you go. It would be better to be judgmental. So you got me there.
Okay.
All right. So I really appreciated the conversation, guys. I hope we get to chat again sometime. Maybe even soon. I really enjoy talking with you guys, and I enjoy the David Wolf channel. Everybody be sure to subscribe to it, and also be sure to subscribe to Shoebat.org, or check out Shoebat.org. I'm trying to flash things on the screen here and not finding it. Shoebat.org.
Yeah, you got to go on the website. You got to go type in shoebat.org on your URL space.
There we go.
Yeah.
Shoebat.org and the David Wolf channel. Be sure to check them out. And we're going to have our philosophy roundtable after this to talk about nerd stuff. And so everybody, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. And God bless everybody. I need to find my stop button.